Good afternoon. Are we here? Do we have the audience on? Good afternoon, friends and colleagues. I would like to welcome you to this session of a much bigger kind of gathering, which has been started yesterday and is looking at turning the COVID-19 crisis into opportunity. What's next for social protection? And what we have in this session are 5 distinguished speakers, all experts in one part or another of the social protection. And I would like to welcome you and also thank the organizers for giving us this platform, particularly in my case, our organization, which is SUSPEN, that is from our end coordinating this. I would like to thank you and welcome you. What we have here is a session that is looking at the migrant response, social protection, lessons from COVID-19. And as I said, we have 5 speakers, and I would like to introduce them. But before I do that, I would like to ask our audience to send in comments and questions to the Q&A box, please. If you click on the Q&A box, not the chat box, those questions will be consolidated and then fed back at the end of the session when the speakers have done their presentation. We are very tight in terms of time. Each speaker has got 4 minutes to get their message across, and none of them has any PowerPoint. I think that will speed things up. But let me introduce our 5 speakers. The first speaker is Miss Giulia Bodi, an Italian national, but really a global citizen, sort of currently works for the World Food Program in Panama. She's worked for UNICEF. She's got degrees from Italy and the US, Colombia, no less. And she's really an expert in terms of the social protection. And nothing, I think, when you think of social protection, nothing comes more to the point other than food and sort of livelihood, the major kind of consideration in terms of livelihood and social protection. So Julia, welcome. And uh, the next speaker is for many people at any rate in Southern Africa and Africa as a whole, needs no introduction, is Professor Marius Olifi. And Marius Olifi, among many other things, is currently the chairperson of the SUSPEN board of guarantees. But his claim to fame, and that is a solid claim, goes much further than that. Marius is sort of the leading expert at any rate among Anglophone lawyers throughout the region, the sub-region of Southern Africa and Africa as a whole. And he's also worked with various organizations, including the ILO, UNDP, the African Union, IOM, you name it. And in fact, he said of Marius that if he doesn't know anything about social protection in Africa, either it is not important or it doesn't exist. That's the that's the sort of the weight of the man. So Marius, welcome. And the next speaker is what I refer to as the future timber, and that is Dr. Gift Dafreya, an upcoming scholar, an economist, sort of who is an outstanding scholar. Currently, he teaches at the University of Venda and is an associate at the Center for Social Development at the University of Johannesburg. But beyond that, he's been involved in a number of key studies, including with the UNDP and touching on social protection. And of course, he is now acknowledged among his cohort as the upcoming and leading scholar in this field. And we have next to him, Jason Tid. I've got that right, finally, Jason, haven't I? And Jason is a senior specialist with the IOM as regional office for Southern Africa, which is based in Pretoria. He is responsible for, among other areas, for coordination at the regional level with communities and governments, in the issues of migration and development of labor mobility, a hands-on expert who I think has a front seat view, I would say, in terms of social protection needs. And then we've got Ms. Tiona, who is at the focal point at the UNICEF Middle East and North Africa Regional Office since January 2019. Tiona currently focuses on children and mixed movement situations in the Rima region, leading the the UNICEF's regional work on outstanding route-based cross-border programming and supporting solutions towards national systems. I would now want to invite the speakers to make their presentations. Remember, colleagues, you only have 4 minutes each to leave as much time as possible for the questions and discussions. And let me leave it at that now. Again, let me remind our audience that you are free and you are encouraged to participate. And you do that by ticking the question and answer box and post your questions. So let me start with the first speaker, Julia, please.
Thank you, Professor Evans. Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be with you today in this important event. So let me get straight to my topic. So, which is actually related to the Venezuela migration crisis and COVID response and social protection response to it. So as of August 2020, approximately 5 million Venezuelan people have fled their country following the political and economic crisis, which actually has resulted in the second largest migration crisis in the world after Syria. And Colombia and Peru currently host the largest share of the migrant population, with 1.7 million and 820,000 people respectively. And around 4 million Venezuelan people are concentrated in 9 countries in the region currently. And as the migration flow increased dramatically between 2017 and 2020, the profile of the migrants actually have been shifting from young people and adults searching for jobs and livelihoods at the beginning of 2017 to include more children and adolescents, including unaccompanied minors, single women and senior citizens who actually were migrating to reuniting their families. And to this crisis, actually, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbating an already very challenged economy in Latin America, and is likely to disproportionately affect the Venezuelan migrant population, given their pre-existing vulnerabilities. And recent projections already from ECLAC on the region and the effect of COVID overall on the region estimated that GDP contraction by 9.1% in 2020, with a related increase in poverty up to 37% and about 15% increase in extreme poverty, which actually is a massive economic crisis basically in the region. So looking at the vulnerabilities of the Venezuelan migrant population in the region and the profile, we have actually some relevant information that comes from WFP remote surveys on migration that were conducted between 2019 and then in waves, actually in 2 different waves in 2020. in April and September in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. And there were key challenges that were identified in terms of food security and nutrition, as well as livelihood and negative coping strategies. For example, on food security and nutrition, approximately 1.9 million Venezuelan migrants are in moderate and severe food insecurity. And 7 out of 10 migrants in these 3 countries were worried not to have enough food during the previous 30 days, which actually has increased significantly from 2019. The proportion of migrants who only had a meal or not at all the day before the interview increased 2.5 times compared to pre-COVID times. And in terms of food consumption, even the situation between April to September has been worsening. For example, in Colombia, there has been a 50% increase in people reporting having spent an entire day without eating during the previous month, with women that show the double of the rate compared to men. Second level of vulnerabilities includes unemployment and informality. For example, 48% of Venezuelan migrants are working without a formal contract in the region, with actually the highest, much higher rates in Peru and Ecuador, where the proportion actually reaches more than 90%. People, due to COVID, actually were affected by loss of income. And in particular, for example, 69% of migrants in these areas had reported loss of income, but the ones working in the informal sector actually reported an 83% of loss of income. And there was an increase in unemployment between April to September, basically going from 18% in April to 31% in September, for example, in Colombia. A third area of vulnerability that the migrants are facing is access to services, and of different kinds. But for example, according to UNHCR, 52% of migrant children did not attend school, also due to the fact that they have recently arrived or they were in transit. COVID, as we were saying, exacerbates those pre-existing vulnerability, as it worsens the humanitarian situation, reduces economic opportunities, both for host population and migrant population, and overburdens the health and social protection system. In terms of the social protection response, a few trends have been identified through a joint UNICEF-WFP regional study on social protection, migration, on COVID, which focuses on 9 countries with the largest share of Venezuelan migrants in the region, which is actually about to be finalized. And maybe I can just mention a few items on this, and then I will stop to let others speak as well. So already before the pandemic, access to social protection for irregular migrants were minimum and limited for regular migrants, with a few exceptions. In terms of social security, in general, there was low access due to the high level of informality of the migrant population. In terms of social assistance, there was limited access to cash transfer program for regular migrants, in particular in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and the Disability Assistance Grant for Trinidad and Tobago. And Brazil is a really interesting case of a country with a favorable legal framework based on which social assistance programs can include migrants with no additional requirements. School feeding as well is linked to access of education, which is granted in all countries with the exception of Trinidad and Tobago. So it actually tends to be higher than other programs. And in the case of COVID response, the response to the pandemic reflected the pre-COVID exclusion pattern. So in particular, it did affect negatively regular migrants who have been excluded mostly from the main social protection response. And for regular migrants, there have been barriers to access in some countries. For example, in cash transfer program in Ecuador and Peru. In Colombia and Argentina, actually, migrants were included, regular migrants, although with a few barriers of access like residence requirements or being registered in the social registry in the case of Colombia. I think I will leave it to that right now. I mean, based on these pre-COVID vulnerabilities and barriers worsened by COVID, a lot of gaps and needs and additional vulnerabilities have been identified, so that social protection response as well at national level had to be complemented by different types also of humanitarian assistance or international development cooperation assistance, which in certain cases actually was leveraged and was highly complementary and built on national social protection systems. And we can look at it a bit more later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia, for that comprehensive presentation. Just to remind the colleagues, the speakers, that we are limited in terms of time. There's so much to talk about. So I'll call on the next speaker, Marius, please.
Thank you, Evans. I'm trying to let my video, okay, thank you. Colleagues, I'll be brief. The theme that I want to address is social protection for migrants in the COVID-19 context, selected legal perspectives. And I'm going to concentrate primarily on South Africa, but a bit broader as well. In the African context, the experience has been since COVID-19 took effect, is that countries have either by way of just plain programming or a few countries by way of legislation been really hesitant to extend social protection, social security in particular, to migrants and migrant workers. Which of course, you know, that has had quite, you know, disastrous impact or effect on the migrants and migrant workers. In the South African case study, I think this is a very interesting one. And the one reason for that is South Africa has a fairly progressive constitution, which with some exception, does not discriminate between citizens and non-citizens. And secondly, we have a very active judiciary in South Africa, and in this particular area, the courts have not been silent, as you will hear within a moment. But the background is that early on in the onset of, during the onset of COVID-19, the government introduced or declared a national state of disaster in terms of the relevant legislation, which of course gave it particular powers to also then to adopt regulations. And through some of those regulations, government actually tried to limit the availability of forms of social protection to, you know, to migrants. I'll come back to that within a moment. But what government, South African government simultaneously did was to extend or to create additional social assistance transfers, for example, a COVID-19 social relief of distress grant, and also measures to support job creation, SMEs, and the like in South Africa. Now, I need to mention that this is a state of national state of disaster, not a state of emergency, which is even a more severe form of restrictions that can be imposed. But nevertheless, the Constitution in Section 37, which is part of the Bill of Rights, makes it very clear that even in the case of national state of emergency, certain rights are non-derogable. In other words, you can't touch them, you can't take them away, actually, even if you can limit them, like equality, human dignity, life, etc., quite critical for the areas we are discussing. So what happened then? The South African government adopted one of these regulations in terms of which it tried to exclude what we call permanent permit holders in South Africa, as well as asylum seekers with valid permits, to exclude them from this new COVID-19 social relief of distress grant, which is a social assistance measure. The permit holders are mainly people from Angola, Lesotho, and Zimbabwe, and quite a number of them actually in the country. They have a special permit status. So we're not talking about those who normally come in on the basis of you know, let's say work permit or so. In any event, this was then challenged, and eventually government had to settle and make an agreement, so to say, with the Scalabrini Center in South Africa, which then was made an order of court, which found the restriction, and I quote, unlawful Let me just read it. Unconstitutional and unlawful and undue infringement of the fundamental rights of the people concerned. So very interesting. Here we have a clear example of how the Constitution was used to extend protection. The other area affected, although we haven't seen recent case law on that, is the issue of access to the labour market. What we have seen in South Africa in the last month or two have been attempts by at least one government department, central government department, and also, secondly, one provincial government in South Africa, issuing regulations to the effect that certain sectors of the labour market would be closed off to foreigners, which of course raises particular questions also from a constitutional perspective. No recent case that I am aware of, but fairly recently, some years ago, well, about 15 years ago, in one judgment, the Supreme Court of Appeal held very clearly that a total blanket on asylum seekers from accessing employment would be unconstitutional because it would leave them destitute and their right to human dignity would be affected. That was followed a few years ago by a second judgment of the same court, the Somali Association case, in terms of which the court arrived at a finding that even if you exclude these, such people from making or earning a livelihood themselves through self-employment, then that would also be unconstitutional. So we have seen important developments, as I've said, in the case law, and in the South African sense, it's very much based on a constitutional interpretation, which I would like to suggest is also fortified by the international law position. South Africa ratified, amongst others, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and that particular instrument also does not allow government to make or to adopt such restrictions that would be inimical to the nature of the very right concerned. So a final issue here concerns the position otherwise of undocumented migrant workers. We haven't seen any case law, but we are aware of the fact that one of the national government departments, inquired into this, and I think actually arrived at a finding that, the international law rule should be upheld in the event of at least access to basic forms of assistance for undocumented migrants, social assistance, if you like, and emergency health care. Although that hasn't transpired in any kind of official documentation or even court judgment. So I think I will stop here, Evans, and we can discuss
thank
this
you,
further
Marius.
later.
Thank you very much.
You.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for that, Marius. Very clear as always in terms of, and very useful as a guide. Is now the Gift is 10, please. Gift, are you there?
Yes, here.
Please go ahead. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you so much. So from me, I think I'll speak mostly to the frequently documented COVID-19 socioeconomic responses that have been provided to migrants. I think I use documents that I have found online, and I must say that the frequently used approach is to offer permit waivers. But aside from that, I will zero down on the COVID-19 social protection related measures that have been availed to migrants. I think I would say that these are mostly found in the global north than in the global south. And this is not accidental, because social protection in the global south is dominated by social assistance, whereas in the global north, it is dominated by social insurance. Now, this is critical because, as we know, social insurance is mostly contributory and risk-based. It is expected to kick in to offer unemployment and medical care benefits to those so affected and have been contributing in terms of premiums before COVID-19, whether someone is a migrant or not. So the dominance of social insurance in the global north definitely presupposes that documented working migrants are likely to have schemes such as medical as well as unemployment insurance, which turn out to be helpful during a crisis such as COVID-19. Suffice to say that such arrangements, because of their private nature, are not well researched and documented. They mostly happen between employees and their employers, and rarely do they involve government subsidies in most parts of, especially the global south. So the measures that have been well documented, I would typically classify them as tax-financed emergency assistance, where transfers in kind or in cash have been temporarily made available to migrants without or with less adequate social protection in place in order to tie them over the COVID-19 crisis. So these emergency transfers are, let me also say here and there, found mostly again in the global north. And in some cases, there is documented evidence that some of these transfers have been made available to undocumented migrants. So I would then say that tax-financed emergency assistance to migrants has been clearly absent in the global south. Now, we could be quick to say the main reason for this could be fiscal constraints, but I'm tempted to also hypothesize that the conflation of social assistance, which dominates in the global south, and emergency assistance is playing a part. Let me expand a bit on this conflation and then I conclude. If you realize the social protection that is dominant in the global south is social assistance, which operates on a citizenship principle, whereas emergency assistance addresses misfortune using the Samaritan principle. So while emergency assistance can definitely be tax financed, it has been also financed by international donors, Good Samaritans in the global south, to an extent that it needed to be managed on a needs basis. However, we have documentary evidence, like in the global south, particularly in Southern Africa, where migrants have been restricted to access non-state emergency social assistance. By non-state, I mean that emergency that is not tax financed, could be coming from NGOs or donors. So their restriction to such definitely speaks to the fact that the host communities could be feeling like the resources are for the nation. They are not differentiating between the tax-financed social assistance, which also comes in cash and in kind, as well as social assistance, which is citizenship-based. So what is the implication for this? The implication, I think, is that without a clear consideration of emergency assistance separate from citizenship-based social assistance in the global south, we stand a likely chance to assist migrants when they are faced with a disaster. Suffice for me to say that perhaps the reporting of these emergency assistance within institutionalized social assistance, should I say, has also made this conflation within some host communities. So with that, Evans, I can stop for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gift. Most appreciated. you make economics sound, easier. Easy, which is it's not an exact science, as you know. Thank you very much for that elucidation. And it's now Jason's turn. Jason, please.
Thanks, Evans. Hi, everybody. Today, I'm going to be speaking about the impact of COVID on migrants and mobility, and I'll be taking the Southern African context for this. What's interesting is actually I'm seeing a lot of similarities, even though we're very far apart, but I'm seeing a lot of similarities in what was being presented by Julia. So just to mention, the impact, it's been an unprecedented impact on human mobility. The current outbreak, it's affected global mobility in complex and very unprecedented ways. We've got, closures of airports, land borders, jobs are drying up, the private sector is being impacted. This is a crisis that spans across several sectors and several issues. There's really, for the IOM, we're seeing that it's unlikely there will be a return in the immediate to the pre-pandemic levels of mobility. Once the travel restrictions are removed, human mobility dynamics are likely to become in the immediate to midterm more localized, regional, perhaps short term. Migration, we feel, will be influenced by pre-existing regional integration, free movement related measures such as visa facilitation and labor mobility channels. And particularly I'm talking about some of the, the more progressive frameworks we have on the African continent vis-a-vis, the integrative agenda of the African Union. Migration, it's a disease that, the COVID has impacted. It's a disease that's spread intrinsically. It's linked with population mobility. SADC in this region, they've got great experience in management of transboundary epidemics, cholera, measles, Ebola plague, yellow fever, and whatnot. But nothing has truly impacted, governments and society as a whole like Corona. Migrants and travelers are not really more vulnerable to the disease risk, but as we said, conditions in which migrants travel, in which travel takes place, often results in these increased vulnerabilities. This is also true and linked to national response and provision of social services to non-nationals, which you hear some of the colleagues commenting upon, and certainly is the case here in Southern Africa as well. Certainly there's an increased vulnerability for people on the move, migrants and mobile populations. COVID has been quite harsh on these communities, but not just, on migrants themselves, but we have to, link back to the countries of origin, communities of origin, households. So this exacerbates the problems. Migrants, be it regular or irregular situations, migrant workers with precarious livelihoods or working in the informal sector. Victims of trafficking, people fleeing wars, persecution, violence, human rights violations, fleeing from disaster, internally displaced. It's across the board that coronavirus has affected. Currently, during the height of the epidemic here, we currently had about 60 to 70,000 international stranded migrants in Southern Africa, with many of them not being provided access to some of these essential services. To the IOM, just to wrap up, truly this crisis is taken on threefold for us. It's a health crisis, first and foremost. It's a protection crisis as well. And it's truly now moving into a socioeconomic crisis. So from the health perspective, certainly of, vulnerability of migrants and mobile populations, as they have limited tools to protect themselves, they're often marginalized from testing or access to service for a number of reasons. Living and working conditions in poor and crowded situations can compromise the health situation. And of course, we have undocumented migrants and asylum seekers, which fear for detention and deportation. So that limits their opportunities and willingness to seek, services. Socioeconomically, it's been very precarious for livelihoods, and many within informal and formal economies have lost jobs. This has great, impacts upon social protection as well, not just for those in country, but also those returning back to their country of origin, and how what we see is an increased pressure on the labor market, in particular the informal sector, and how this is going to negatively impact, communities and the countries as the migrants return. Of course, that doesn't limit the fact that once mobility increases a bit, they will of course want to return to these countries of destination like South Africa. And finally, just to kind of with the protection crisis, rights of migrants and asylum seekers and refugees are certainly being infringed upon. There's a lot of issues now arising of xenophobia, racism, and stigmatization. And at the end of the day, there has been, governments did scramble to extend social protection schemes to the most vulnerable, but often, as we see, those most vulnerable did not necessarily include some of the population of concern that we're talking here today. I'll leave you with just saying that, a few points of reflection for us, and I'm just kind of echoing our Director General just to say, exclusion in this sense is costly in the long run, whereas inclusion from the beginning pays off for everyone. And I think everybody here in this meeting would agree to that. We would also say no one is safe until everybody is safe. And certainly to us, what we would want to put across is we know that there's been an impact on mobility, but let's not forget that mobility really should be a part of the solution. And the best way to recognize that important contribution made by people on the move and those within our societies during the crisis. But migrants, they are a vulnerable population. But we also need to recognize that facilitation of mobility in all of its forms is really should be seen as a development enabler and really part of the response coming out of the coronavirus epidemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. I suspect you have kept within time. I'm not sure, but that was very succinct. And now we have Tiona. Last but not least, at least Tiona, you have got the opportunity to say the last word. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, thank you. I think following my co-panelists, I would like to today focus my intervention and introduce a lens that allows us to see children in the context of international migration. I will speak about some of the challenges we're observing in the region I work in the MENA region, and then speak about some of the implications for programming, particularly relevant for children. Firstly, I would like to discuss three contexts of international migration where we see particular relevance for children, and then briefly touch upon how they've been affected in the context of COVID-19. So the first context, that's the one of labor migration. So that's labor migration to the MENA region, particularly to the countries of Gulf Cooperation Council, but in the MENA region in general. So this context is relevant for us because children appear here as sort of dependents, as children of migrant workers who are accompanying their parents, or they were born to their migrant parents in hosting countries, or children who are left behind in countries of origin. So colleagues spoke about, disruption of mobility, disruption of remittances, loss of jobs, which particularly affected migrants in the informal sector, particularly female migrants. And implications of these are significant for children. Remember that this is also the region where, particularly in the GCC countries, you have 35 to 90% of the national population comprised of migrants. So we're talking about quite a significant number of migrants affected. So let's focus on children now. So children born to migrant parents are often undocumented due to birth registration barriers that children born out of wedlock face. Current crisis has exacerbated some of these risks, some of the barriers. Undocumented children have greater obstacles accessing services, basic services, and in circumstances when their parents have been also deprived of jobs and are not accessing social protection, impact on their well-being can be detrimental. Now, children left behind as part of the families in the countries of origin will experience reduction of remittances or delays in remittances, or potentially longer separation periods from their migrant parents, which again, comprises a compounded effect that's quite negative. Now let's move to the second context. That's MENA countries as sending countries of labor migrants. Here, children are relevant as, again, those left behind who depend on remittances largely. Some of the challenges are similar to what I already described, but keep in mind that, you know, in the MENA region, we have quite a large number of countries that whose GDP depends on remittances quite significantly. So the top 5 countries in the region, in terms of proportion of remittances of GDP, are, you know, range within the 10 to 16%. We also, however, this year we expect about 20% drop in remittances, and we also have projected that about 12.12 million children are going to kind of fall into poverty. So this is to put things and vulnerabilities in perspective. Now, the third context, that's the context of the so-called mixed migration flows, where populations move due to various reasons. Part of those can be economic, could be linked to forced displacement. So this is the group where we expect to see children directly. So children, child migrants who are directly affected by the mobility restrictions, by the socioeconomic impact of the pandemic. This group of, you know, mixed migration flows are several in the region. They crisscross the region in multiple directions. For instance, one of the routes that starts in the Horn of Africa moves to the Gulf via Yemen. That includes children as well. It's one of the most risky routes. About 10% of population are children, including unaccompanied and separated ones. What we've observed during this time is decreased access to basic services in general, you know, in transit and at destination, decreased family reunification opportunities, quarantine or immigration detention, pushbacks from borders and returns, and similar measures of that involuntarily disrupt their journeys. These children are often not registered, so their status is irregular, and they do not want to be registered due to fear of deportation or forced return. In addition, some of our recent studies show that the trust in authorities, trust in professionals is extremely limited. Social workers are probably one of the few exceptions where the trust of the children is relatively higher. Now, if we look at the recent social protection responses, and I'm referring to the recent analysis undertaken by the Issue-Based Coalition on Social Protection in the MENA region, and I'll post the link in the chat box afterwards, we see that, you know, a lot of MENA countries have undertaken several social protection measures or expanded their existing measures. There have been a few that were applicable to migrants, but most of them, as previous panelists spoke, covered regular migrants in regular situations, or those whose regular status has just expired. So, and if a couple of contexts where assistance has been extended to the forcibly displaced persons. The analysis, the review actually identifies that exclusion of informal workers, including non-nationals, is one of the key gaps of the regional child protection, regional social protection schemes. Partly because these workers are not registered, or partly because they're not non-nationals. Now, in terms of, if we think about implications for programming and what we would like to see, firstly, for migrant children and families themselves, considering the multidimensional impact of the pandemic that I talked about, also considering the lack of trust in services and unwillingness to be registered often, for regular migrants. Protection measures should be combined with enhanced access to healthcare in the current context, but also with social work and child protection services that will help to address exclusion errors, but will also help to deliver a holistic package of services to address multiple vulnerabilities. Secondly, in the context of migrant workers and their children left behind in countries of origin, one of the key measures would be ensuring remittance services are considered as essential services, which is a major advocacy point on many fronts right now. Also, in countries of origin, monitoring and mitigating the effects of border closures, delayed remittance flows, policy changes in receiving and sending countries is an important factor to ensure that children left behind are included in social protection schemes in countries of origin and in holistic services when possible. And lastly, we'll know, and my co-panelists have spoken about, that there are a multitude of barriers when it comes to inclusion of migrant children and migrants, in general, in national social protection schemes. So, this could be political, related to physical space limitations, and sometimes technical barriers such as targeting, lack of registration of migrants, access to technology, etc. but there are legal and international migration governance frameworks that exist. Firstly, social protection is a human right, and also the Convention on the Rights of the Child does explicitly apply to all children in the country, not off the country, which extends the responsibility of the states over migrant children in terms of international legal framework. The Global Compact on Migration, a non-binding document, however, accepted by a large number of states in its Objective 15, does speak about safe access to migrants to basic services. Again, this is one of the commitments that a lot of states have signed up to. And we also know that there are few, but there are good practices of migrant inclusion in social services and social protection. For instance, in Thailand, access to healthcare has been extended to migrants, including irregular migrants. And there are some other examples that are emerging. So I think our objective here of UNICEF, partners, civil society organizations, I think academics, is to really play a role in identifying the barriers for inclusion, which can be different in each country, and really try to find an entry point where they may exist and create a political and both political and fiscal space for advocating for inclusive social protection programs for migrant children and migrants in general. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Yeah, thank you, Tiona, for that rather longish, but nevertheless clear last word. Now, yeah, friends and colleagues, we don't have much time by way of questions. We are within 12 minutes of when we should stop. Just to get to the session now where our panelists respond to certain questions that have been posed. We'll come to that in a moment, but also to ask the panelists to bear in mind as they answer these questions, 4 kind of key questions that were raised from the outset. How have migrants been affected by COVID-19? What have been the socio-economic responses extended to migrants? What are the legal framework that are in place for migrants to tap into social protection at destination? How can social protection be used to address migrants? And what role do the informal forms of social security have on migrants? So those are the kind of questions that I think we, as you answer the questions that have been posed, should be borne in mind. Some of those, of course, you have already addressed in your presentations. Now we have here 3 questions that I have in the Q&A box. The first one is from Bruno, and he's saying, as part of the legal provisions, are there examples of the use of bilateral work agreements between countries? Good practice of clauses for workers to benefit from social protection measures, ideally in the same way as nationals? That's the first question. That I think any of the, I suspect that is more a legal question that Professor Olifi might respond to, lead in response rather, not necessarily exclusively. The second one is directed at Professor Olifi, and this is from Yao Pedro, thanking him. And his quick question is, did the expansion of social protection measures by courts include all migrants, or were there a set of conditions? And the third one that I have in this first round is from Imena Peroni, that thanking Julia for an interesting kind of presentation, and asking her to explain further if access to social protection within migration changes across the type of mobility, and which could be enablers to have a social protection more sensitive to different types of mobility, which not only implies different hosting countries, but different vulnerabilities, different needs, regulatory environment, as well as income means, to name a few. So those are the first three questions I think we should address in the first round, and we'll sort of take a second round of questions after that. And just again to urge speakers to be very brief, because we have less than 10 minutes to go. Thank you.
Evan, since you addressed the first question or two to me, Marius speaking, so let me try and respond. If I heard the first question correct, I'm not sure whether I did, so whether there are any kind of formal bilateral agreements between
yes,
country of destinations.
Any kind
Yes.
of bilateral use of bilateral work agreements between
Yes,
countries.
yes, I can add to that a question in the chat box posed by Luca Pellerano,
Yes.
whether there's any cooperation between countries of origin and destination, because I think it touches on the same. The first one
Yes.
looks at the formal agreements. Honestly, at least in African context, I'm not aware of a single formal bilateral agreement that has been concluded, which shows us, the struggle that the African countries, are having to deal appropriately with COVID-19. And in fact, the non-formal arrangements that we have that I know of are not necessarily legal arrangements in terms of legal cooperation, but more kind of unilateral arrangements made by countries of origin. I'm not talking now about countries of destination might or might not be doing. We discussed this African case, but we have a few interesting examples of what countries of origin have done in terms of, in relation to their own migrant workers abroad. And the Philippines, for example, have extended to their overseas, what they call OFWs, unilateral one-time grant of $200 in the case that they may have attracted or contracted COVID-19 in the country of destination. Then we have several arrangements where countries have instituted, of course, return arrangements, not necessarily legally speaking so, although in the case of Nepal, there was actually a Supreme Court a decision to this effect that kind of forced the Nepali government to use a particular fund to bring back, the workers to Nepal. But several countries have extended, upon return, monetary and other support to the returnees: Thailand, Nepal, Indonesia. But much of this is not really legal. The other question was whether, in this African case, what I discussed, whether all migrants have been or are affected, which is a very interesting question. Well, you have to go back to the regulations and exclusionary nature thereof. The regulation tried to exclude permit holders who, were it not for the permit, would have been in any event undocumented in South Africa, permit holders from Angola, Lesotho, and Zimbabwe, and also asylum seekers with a valid permit. And that was struck down as unconstitutional. So that left us actually with the question, what about undocumented migrant workers, and which there are many in South Africa? Well, as I've said, we haven't seen any court judgment on this, but in my view, it's really clear from a constitutional perspective. And the fact that the South African borders until very recently were just closed, I mean, these people would have been exposed to utter destitution. So the fundamental right, or the human right, if you like, to human dignity at least, would play a role, and certainly the obligation on the courts in South Africa for purpose of interpreting any of the fundamental rights to consider international law, whether binding or non-binding, would lead the courts, I would think, to the position under international law, as I said earlier, that undocumented migrant workers are at least entitled to the minimum base level forms of assistance, social assistance, if you like, and emergency health care. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Marius. Thank you for that. And I think it's Julia's turn now, because there have been, in fact, a supplementary question to Imena's question. That is asking how, if there are any, the role of humanitarian international development sector to complement social protection efforts to address the needs of vulnerable migrants. So if you take that together with the the original what, I think, and try to answer it as briefly as possible, please. We are within 4 minutes of our time.
Okay, I will try. So first of all, one of the access or the prerequisites basically to access social protection programs, as I mentioned, has been in general having some sort of regular status, legal status as migrants as Venezuelan migrants in the different countries. For example, even a temporary permit like the PEP in Colombia or the PEP in Peru, among others. So regular status actually might provide access to the national social protection systems, or at least some parts of it, and social assistance programs, for example, different types of cash transfers, and, for example, grant access or the inclusion in the national social registries, which are a fundamental, for example, entry points within national social protection system, even if they don't necessarily grant a beneficiary status, but at least it does place the migrants as eligible to receive different types of benefits. In the case of Colombia,
we have to leave it there, Julia. We have to leave it. We are within.
Yeah, sorry. Like
2
it's
minutes.
yeah.
Marina, the host. Let me talk to the host. Do we have any possibility of extension at all? Because we are within 2 minutes of 2 o'clock.
Yes, you can go 5 minutes over time.
5 minutes, okay. That said, I think we still have two questions.
Okay.
Julia, it's sort of just one quick last word, and then we have got 2 more questions that I want us to cover. In fact, several of them. Yeah, thank you.
In terms of complementary humanitarian response, I mean, that's really, it seems that it's really needed for irregular migrants, and that's actually what also the R4V platform, the regional platform, has been focusing on. And there are interesting examples like the Arauca pilot in Colombia, or an example in Guyana, where actually there is a complementary efforts and actually of building the response and on national social protection subsystems. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Julia. Sorry to interrupt you. And then the next question is to Jason. There are good practices to flag from the perspectives of cooperation and coordination between countries of origin and destination in dealing with the migrants' access to social security during COVID. Jason, please, quickly.
Thanks, Evan.
Jason, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. As far as I mean, yes, in the Southern Africa region, what we have now is, due to some of the issues of non-access that we've had in South Africa in particular, there has been a lot of engagement at the diplomatic level, where countries of origin and destination with South Africa have been discussing on providing, provision of access and assistance for those here that are left in South Africa, but also for those that are returning. But this is an ongoing discussion, and I think, certain good cases could be Zimbabwe. I'm just trying to highlight certain aspects of Zimbabwe, the relationship with Zimbabwe in South Africa. But to be honest, the complexities of the return and the complexities that we have with the migration space right now, good examples are hard to come by, to be honest with you, a little bit in the Southern Africa region. But as we begin deliberating more, across the border and whatnot, we're starting to see certain things come about. But I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Jason. And we have the last one, which is to address to Tiona. Can social protection measures be designed to address multiple vulnerabilities of children in the context of migration? Tiona, please.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think I answered some of the questions in my presentation, but I think the key, so one of the key considerations on design is the issue of firewalls. That's what we found, the so-called firewalls, especially in the case of irregular migrants, because the fear of accessing services, if they're available, you know, due to deportation concerns is so great that even if their services exist, often migrants choose not to access them, especially if the monetary value of the cash assistance isn't so great. So, I mean, I think one of the key concerns is, one of the key considerations is to make, to design firewalls between social protection and immigration services. And the second principle would be to really make them, make services really holistic and sort of integrate social protection measures with other protection measures and maybe health responses in this context, to make sure that we really tap into the multiple vulnerabilities that children usually exhibit in our context. So these are mainly the 2 points I would like to emphasize.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tiona. I think we should wrap up now. Just for me to thank our host, Marina, and co-host, Susan, and above all, the audience who have been following this, and the speakers, of course, who have made it possible. But also to remind the audience that, as I said, this is part of a sort of a broader kind of sessions in terms for that started yesterday and are going on until the 8th. What we have, the upcoming sessions include the Clinic 4B, preparing our social protection sector for the future shocks in terms of COVID. And then we also have a roundtable, you know, discussion on gender responses to social protection in times of COVID. And just as I keep saying, these sessions go on until the 8th. So just to thank you again, the audience, the panelists, and our hosts. I think this has been quite an informative kind of session. And I'm grateful for the privilege of sort of, you know, moderating the presentations. Thank you very much, and have a blessed day.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
to all of you.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Marina, for hosting us.